Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, sponsored by the Associates for Biblical Research. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. On Digging for Truth, we explore and defend the truthfulness and reliability of the 66 books of the Bible, God's special revelation. For our next two episodes, we'll be talking with Dr. William Ross about the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is commonly referred to as the Septuagint. Dr. Ross is the assistant professor of Old Testament at Reformed Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina, and he joins us today by Skype. Dr. Ross, welcome to Digging for Truth.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on the program. Now, before we get started in our discussion about the Septuagint, we have to cover a little bit of ground that you and I are fellow Westminster Seminary grads.
That's right. That's right.
And it turns out that we were students at the same time, but we never met each other.
Yeah. You know, it's not that big of a school, but somehow this happens.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I was a part-time student working full-time and commuting for 8.5 years to finish my degree. So right. I didn't get to connect with people as much as I would have liked. But I'm glad that we're connecting now. And thanks for coming on the show.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here.
All right. So before we get started in talking about the Septuagint, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background, your interests, and more specifically, why did you choose to study the Septuagint?
Yeah, it's a great question. I get it a lot, believe it or not. Well, to introduce myself first, I'm a Philadelphia native, born there, lived there all the way through my time in seminary. I've been married for 11 years this Friday, actually. And I've been here at RTS Charlotte for almost 2 years beginning. I began teaching here in January of 2019. I teach Old Testament and biblical languages, Hebrew, as well as Greek, obviously due to my experience in Septuagint scholarship. Prior to being here at RTS, I was a doctoral student at the University of Cambridge in Cambridge, England. And that's where I spent 4 years studying Septuagint and carrying out my doctoral research. Prior to that, as you said already, I was at Westminster. So that's just a brief background on myself. I'm married, as I said, with 4 children, and we just love being here in Charlotte.
Well, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Happy anniversary, by the way.
Thank you.
So the subject that you are, I would say, an expert in, and we can say that because you've done the grind of the PhD at Cambridge, is the Septuagint, although you teach in other areas. So let's start with the most fundamental question, which is actually not a simple question to answer, and that is, what is the Septuagint?
Yeah, it's a great question. This is the starting point for all of the discussion you have to have. What is it, right? What's the it we're even talking about here? And there's a number of ways to come at this kind of question. For most, I think, non-specialists, lay people, even pastors and scholars who have some background in biblical studies, they tend to use the term the Septuagint in a very broad way. And I think among scholars, at least, there's some recognition of they kind of know what they mean when they're talking about the Septuagint, but don't always clarify themselves in very precise terms. And one of the consequences of that is that when scholars or lay people read about the Septuagint, to whatever extent that happens, things can go unsaid, and that can lead to assumptions that aren't always helpful. So I think it can be a good way to start by explaining what the Septuagint isn't. And that can help us frame more discussion about what it actually is. So the Septuagint is not a number of things. First of all, it's not a singular or unified translation. It was not completed by a committee in some kind of intentional or strategized way. Although we can say something about that a little bit in more detail about the Pentateuch, the Greek Pentateuch. The Septuagint was also not something that in the ancient world would have existed in print between two covers, as if it could be kept on a bookshelf. And so we have to guard against anachronism in certain ways in thinking about the Septuagint as this sort of singular kind of entity.
Yes. So as we're setting the stage here, already the audience is getting a sense. Okay, the Septuagint is not a it, and it is actually quite complex. So you mentioned the Pentateuch, and that's a perfect way, I think, for us to begin the conversation, because that sort of signifies the beginning of what we call the Septuagint now. So maybe you could give the audience a tutorial on the beginning, the first 5 books of Moses.
Right. Yeah, great place to start. The Septuagint is in many ways associated with the translation into Greek of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy, commonly known among scholars as the Pentateuch and within the Jewish community as well. Traditionally, historically, the Septuagint, strictly defined, or Septuagint proper, you might say, was considered the Greek translation of the Pentateuch. And there are a number of historical reasons why that was considered the Septuagint proper. We can get into those in a minute, but scholars generally recognize that the Greek Pentateuch was the first translation of the Hebrew Bible, is the earliest. It probably occurred sometime in the mid-3rd century BC, and it was completed within the Jewish community living in Ptolemaic Alexandria, or in the environment around Alexandria in Egypt. This is at a time after the end of the Persian Empire, where the Greek Empire has come to prominence, led by the famous Alexander the Great, who began the Hellenistic age and spread Greek culture and language throughout the Mediterranean world. And one of the effects of that initially in the Jewish community was to translate their scriptures into Greek, which began, like we said, with the Pentateuch.
So we have a couple things going on. We have a Jewish community a substantial one living in Alexandria, and I think we know that from historical records and other evidence that's the case.
Right.
2, that they thought it was important enough to translate, and 3, they had Hebrew scrolls with them already down in Egypt, which we actually know that Jews were living there shortly after the exile. So these are some things that are indications of this. Now, we only have about 20 seconds left, so I'll wrap up this portion by saying we're going to talk about the next books, okay? Because everybody knows that we got 34 more books of the Bible, of the Old Testament,
right,
that we need to discuss.
Exactly.
So don't go away, folks. We'll be right back, and Dr. Ross is going to pick up that conversation and explain further Greek translations of the rest of the Bible. We'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. I'm here with Dr. William Ross, and we're talking about the Greek translation of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint. Now, Will, we were in our last segment set the stage talking about the Pentateuch, but that's just the beginning of the story, the first 5 books of Moses, and it was translated in Alexandria. That seems clear from the evidence, which we're going to discuss. But why don't you pick it up from there, because there's a lot more books of the Old Testament that we need to talk about.
Right, absolutely. So, as I said, scholars generally recognize and agree that the Greek Pentateuch was the initial translation project. Proposals vary widely about how that looked, how long it might have taken, why it happened, and so forth. But everyone obviously then will acknowledge and go on to see how the other translations were made also within the Jewish community, mostly centered in Egypt, probably in Alexandria, but maybe surrounding cities or the Kora, the countryside as well, over the following number of centuries, possibly into the 1st century AD or the 2nd century AD. There is general consensus that every book was translated probably by the end of the 1st century AD or so, the latest books probably being books like the Song of Songs, Lamentations, Ezra, Nehemiah, and some others. But in terms of the general flow, order, chronology of the translation of other books, people go in a variety of different directions, and it's very difficult, in fact, to establish any secure chronology. At most, we have some proposals. One very prominent proposal put forward by a scholar by the name of Gilles Dorival, a French scholar, and he proposed some of the earlier books, including Psalms, Isaiah, and the minor prophets, but not necessarily in that order. So it's very difficult to say.
Okay. So when you were talking about the Pentateuch before, it seems the evidence is pretty clear that they were translated, as one unit, if you want to say it that way. But how about these other books? I mean, you had mentioned that we're not talking about an it. So does this mean that we're talking about individual scrolls of individual books being translated and then distributed? And take it from there. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, it's an unfolding process. So after the tradition of translation springs into life in the 3rd century Jewish community in Hellenistic Egypt, you have further books being translated, as we were just saying. But as new books are being translated from a Hebrew scroll into a Greek scroll, you have that book then being copied by hand, one copy at a time, and used or duplicated, distributed in a variety of ways. And in that process, we see kind of two different processes unfold. On the one hand, you have a tradition where that the goal is to copy it just as it is and to just perpetuate it, preserve it. Other times, we see tendencies towards revising and improving the Greek translation according to a number of criteria that we may or may not fully understand. But as the whole Septuagint, to use the term we're struggling to define, as that was coming into existence over the following centuries, books that were already in existence in Greek, already had been translated, began to be revised at a fairly early stage as other books were not yet translated or would be translated in future centuries.
So that to audience members who may not be familiar with this, I'm going to admit up front, when I started reading about this, that started to get very confusing to me. But this is what we're dealing with this trail of evidence. So we have the Pentateuch to begin with, and while the new books are being translated, the Pentateuch is being revised. Maybe you could explain that a little bit further, just to what were they revising it to? What was their goal in the opinion of scholars in doing that?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are a number of traditions that we could allocate the textual transmission of the Septuagint into in terms of translation approach and goals for the revision. The Pentateuch itself, the kind of translation, the style that was established, the approach taken, established its own tradition. And other books that came later, like the Minor Prophets, the Book of Judges, the Psalms, continued that general approach. We also have a tradition that we might call a paraphrastic tradition, books like Proverbs or Job or Isaiah, where there are substantial pluses and minuses, rearrangements of portions of the text in the Greek translation itself. It's more of a paraphrase. But then you have this revisional tradition, and in that tradition, in books like Judges, again, Samuel and Kings, the Minor Prophets, there is a revision. And there are two general impetuses for the revision. Number one is to take the existing Greek translation and to make it closer in a word-for-word kind of order to an existing Hebrew source text. And so they're taking an existing translation and making it more conformed to an original Hebrew text. The other goal that we can identify is that as they're doing that, Oftentimes, the choices they make in revising that text are actually motivated by a desire to use Greek in a more educated way or a more sophisticated way. And historically, sometimes those two motivations have been pitted against each other, but that's not necessarily the case.
So maybe to use an analogy, and maybe I'm oversimplifying this, but for our audience, I want to boil it down at points two to just help guide them along, is improving an English translation. So over the centuries, we've seen that. We have the King James, we have the NIV, we have the Authorized Version. Got about a minute left in this segment, Will. Could you just comment on that, maybe that analogy a little bit? And is that helpful? And any other comments you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can make an analogy like that where you have in the English Bible world a number of translations in existence, some of them recent, some of them older. All of them justified on the basis of certain goals. Some of those goals have to do with faithfulness to the Hebrew source text or the Greek source text that we're translating from. Others have more concern to convey the message, the content of that meaning in a more accessible way to their audience. So you could put a KJV on one side and an NIV on the other side. And it's not necessarily a spectrum. There's more dimensions than just left and right or one side and the other. But there's different kinds of motivations that go into when someone sits down to revise a translation, say, okay, what would make this better? What do I want to convey this meaning of the Hebrew more accurately? Or do I want to do it with more style? Do I want to do it in a way that teenagers might understand? Things like that. So there's similar kinds of sets of decision-making criteria come into play.
Yeah, and that's very important to understand that these translators, as far as we know, had positive objectives in mind when they were doing this. They're trying to either more closely preserve the text or communicate it better or something along those lines. And I think that's a very helpful way to understand it. Well, Will, believe it or not, this segment's done, so we're going to have to go to a break, and we'll be right back. Folks, please don't go away. We're talking about the Septuagint with Dr. William Ross, and we'll be right back.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your co-host, Henry Smith. I'm here with Dr. William Ross. We're talking about the Septuagint, the Old Testament translation of the Hebrew Bible in antiquity. So now, Will, we talked about a little bit about the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. There's this letter that scholars consider, and I would agree, and I think you agree too, is largely legendary, that tells a story about the origin of Septuagint, but it's really important historically. Maybe you could tell people about this letter, what it's called, and unpack that a little bit for the audience.
Yeah, great question. So this is a very important aspect of Septuagint scholarship. It's generated much discussion over the years. The Letter of Aristeas, or the Letter of Aristeas to Philocrates. It's written by someone calling themselves Aristeas. And it is framed as an eyewitness account of the events that occurred within the Hellenistic royal court in Egypt. And it's an account of Aristeas' own efforts to persuade the high priest of Jerusalem to arrange for the translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Pentateuch in particular, first 5 books, into Greek. And so the letter, which is very quite lengthy actually, recounts this whole process, the events that led up to it, and particularly the role of Ptolemy II, the Greek-Egyptian ruler at the time, and his role in commissioning that project for his own royal library.
And so in that letter, and maybe you could build on that a little bit, is a sort of story about the 70 translators. Why don't you tell the audience about that and
Right.
what's happening with that?
So once the Ptolemy II is persuaded, he has the translators essentially dispatched with the approval of the high priest in Jerusalem. From Jerusalem, they arrive at Ptolemy's palace. When they show up, there's 72 of them, 12 from each tribe. They are bearing the best copy of the Hebrew scriptures from Jerusalem, written in gold characters. And they are welcomed on their arrival to a 7-day feast where there's this fabulous banquet. And afterwards, they set to work and complete the translation in 72 days. And there's various accounts of this legend, not just in the Letter of Aristeas, but in other ancient authors as well. In some versions, they each retreat to their own study space, essentially, and complete the translation in completely identical fashion. They all come out with the exact same results. So this is viewed as one plausible account within the ancient world for where the Septuagint, at least the Greek Pentateuch, came from.
Yes, and it seems clear that is not what happened. But it's interesting. I have a confession to make. When I first got saved, I was in my late 20s, and I was debating with an atheist about the truth of Christianity. I didn't know anything. And I found out about this legend and shared and tried to convince this person from an apologetic standpoint that it was true. And I wish I could take it back, but I can't. But it is something we should not use as an apologetic, that particular argument. Is there anything useful about the letter, though, for us? Maybe you could give one or two tidbits of what from the letter is helpful to us.
Yeah. Scholars go different ways with this. I think it's safe to say that most Septuagint scholars view the letter as legendary, either in part or in whole, particularly the more miraculous aspects of it, not because miracles don't exist, but because we have no real reason to think that this particular miracle occurred. Yes. There are plenty of historical errors and significant improbabilities within the account itself. Demetrius, the librarian, may not have been the librarian at the Alexandrian library at the right time, and so forth and so on. But there are a number of things that we can gain from it. For one thing, it shows that the Jewish community in Egypt was concerned to validate their translation as being reliable and associating it with the Jewish community living in Jerusalem at the time. And they were concerned, clearly, that it represented the Hebrew text that would have been recognized as authoritative in an accurate way. So that is something we learn about the fact that the letter was written at all, whether or not the details are completely accurate or not.
Yes. Yeah, I've read some scholarship, Benjamin Wright being one, and a couple of others who have argued that it was an apologetic for the Septuagint. The Jewish community had been using it, and they wanted to defend its usage effectively. Would you agree with that assessment, Will? Is that a fair assessment of it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the Jewish community in Egypt wanted to validate their use of Scripture in translation, and so that was especially one reason for it. There's lots of other historical nuggets that I think we can see in the letter as well. There's probably good reason to see some kind of external motivation for the original project of the Septuagint translation of the Pentateuch to begin with. And there may have been some kind of royal sponsorship involved. We're not exactly sure how that looked. But the Jews had a place within the broader Hellenistic world. They were not completely isolated. They had a role in broader society. We see that kind of role, that interaction with the culture around them by virtue of this letter as well, being written in Greek at all, and the knowledge of the royal court that it clearly contains. So that's valuable as well.
Well, that's very good, Will. Well, believe it or not, that's a good way to wrap up the show. We've come down to the end. So thanks for being here for this episode and giving us a really solid introduction. We're going to have you back for part 2 so we can build on what we've discussed here. And really grateful to have you on the show. Looking forward to the next one.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
All right, appreciate it. Well, friends, we've been talking about the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. You're going to find in this episode of the next that providentially God used this to preserve his text, to edify the church and intertestamental Judaism. And there was a great purpose for the Septuagint. It's not something that should be pushed aside. It's very interesting and exciting for us to study it. And so we hope that you'll come back for part 2 of this episode with Dr. William Ross talking about the Septuagint. And we thank you for joining us today for this episode of Digging for Truth.